The air in Containment Cell 7 was a perfect, sterile composition of recycled oxygen and inert nitrogen, scrubbed of every stray molecule of dust, every lingering microbe, every trace of life. It tasted of nothing. It smelled of nothing. It was the architectural equivalent of a vacuum, designed to preserve the asset within as a pure, uncontaminated instrument. Elara sat on the edge of the integrated cot, his bare feet pressed against the cool, seamless polymer of the floor. The sensation was a known quantity, a fixed point in the unending cycle of regulated days and artificially dimmed nights. Cold, smooth, unyielding. He focused on it, the simple, physical truths of the floor beneath his feet, a grounding technique he had been taught to employ when the data streams became overwhelming. But there was no data stream now. There was only the silence, a low, resonant hum from the environmental controls that was more a pressure in the ears than a sound. A tremor started deep in his belly, a flicker of warmth so alien in the refrigerated stillness of his existence that he thought it was a malfunction of his own biology. His cycles were monitored, suppressed, managed with a precision that bordered on the fanatical. An unscheduled event was not a possibility. It was a contradiction in terms. Yet the warmth spread, a slow, insidious tide rising through his veins, coiling in his gut. It was not the sharp, intrusive probe of a remote data-gathering session, nor the phantom ache of simulated emotional feedback. This was his. It was a deep, primal thrum that resonated with the very marrow of his bones, a forgotten song his body was beginning to remember. The scent blockers implanted beneath his skin were supposed to be absolute, a chemical cage built around his essential nature. But he could feel them straining, a faint, high-pitched whine at the edge of his perception, like metal under torsion. Soon they would fail. He was E7, an observer, a rare omega whose empathic and pheromonal sensitivities had been weaponized, honed into a tool for gauging dissent and predicting social volatility in the outer sectors. They would place his consciousness, untethered, into the chaotic heart of a rioting city, or the tense silence of a parley between warring factions. And he would feel it all. He would absorb the rage, the fear, the brittle hope, and the all-consuming despair. Then they would pull him back, reeling and fractured, and the director's technicians would extract the raw emotional data like venom from a snake. They called it a necessary service, a cornerstone of managed stability. They called him an asset. He was not an asset. He was a vessel, filled and emptied at their convenience, and the process was leaving him hollowed out, ghosted by the echoes of 1,000 strangers' lives. The warmth was a fever now, prickling at his skin. A faint sheen of moisture bloomed on his forehead. He pressed his palm against the wall, another seamless, sterile surface, and imagined he could feel the vibrations of the spire around him. This tower, a sterile needle piercing the polluted sky, was the only world he knew. He was born in its medical wing, raised in its educational creches, and installed in this cell upon the first manifestation of his abilities. Freedom was a concept he understood only through the data he absorbed, the desperate, violent yearning for it from a rebel's dying mind, the quiet, philosophical appreciation of it from a poet watching a forbidden sunrise. He had never felt the sun on his skin. He had never breathed unfiltered air. A memory surfaced, unbidden. The director, standing on the other side of the transparent containment field that separated his cell from the observation deck. Her face was a mask of placid professionalism, her silver hair coiled in a severe, perfect knot. She never raised her voice. She never showed emotion. She was the architect of his world, a calm, calculating deity of his sterile universe. "Your stability is paramount, E7, she had said, her voice a filtered, disembodied sound through the comms. "Your biological state is a variable we control for the greater good. Anomaly is weakness. Predictability is strength." Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no malice. They held nothing at all. It was the dispassionate gaze of a scientist observing a particularly valuable specimen. He was not a person to her. He was a delicate, dangerous instrument that required constant calibration. The thrumming in his blood intensified, and a new sensation bloomed in his chest, a profound, aching loneliness that was entirely his own. It was a hollow space that no amount of foreign emotion could fill. With the loneliness came a desperate, instinctual call, a silent cry from the core of his being for something he couldn't name. It was a need for resonance, for an answering frequency in the vast, empty silence. He squeezed his eyes shut. The white walls of his cell seemed to press inward, the recycled air suddenly too thin to breathe. The scent of ozone, sharp and sterile, filled his senses as the air filtration system kicked into a higher cycle, a programmed response to his rising temperature. It was the smell of control, the smell of his cage, but beneath it, faint and terrifyingly sweet, was another scent. It was the first hint of honeysuckle and night-blooming jasmine, a fragrance of organic, uncontrollable life. It was his own. The cage was breaking. He was not an instrument. He was not a specimen. He was an omega, and his heat, unscheduled, untamed, and utterly real, was coming. And in the sterile, controlled world of the spire, that was an act of rebellion. The hum inside him was no longer just a biological event. It was a broadcast. His empathic sense, usually directed outward by the director's technicians, was turning inward, amplifying his own state, and then projecting it. A low, pulsing wave of distress, of need, of burgeoning fever. It seeped through the walls, a psychic contamination in the spire's clean data streams. He could feel the faint, distant flicker of anxiety from the guards in the corridor, the spike of alarm from the technician monitoring his vitals on a screen 2 levels above. Their panic was a thin, brittle thing, easily distinguishable from the deep, rolling tide of his own transformation. He was becoming a signal, a beacon of biological chaos in a world built on absolute order. And somewhere, in the cold, silent void beyond the spire's walls, he felt a flicker of something else, a resonance, a distant point of light, impossibly far away, that seemed to pulse in time with his own racing heart. It was not a mind he was reading. It was a presence he was feeling, steady, solid, a low, powerful hum that vibrated on a frequency he had never known but recognized with a certainty that defied logic. He focused on it, this distant star in his inner darkness, and for the first time he did not feel entirely alone. The call he had sent out into the void had impossibly received an answer. The cockpit of the Interceptor-class vessel, Nyx, was a sphere of dark glass and cool, glowing instrumentation suspended in the silent, star-dusted blackness of high orbit. Here, there was only the mission. There was only the vector, the velocity, the precise and elegant mathematics of flight. Captain Kalen, Alpha Prime pilot of the Central Authority, rested his gloved hands on the control yoke, his touch light, almost reverent. The ship was an extension of his will, a fusion of nerve and alloy that responded to his slightest command with flawless obedience. He demanded nothing less from the Nyx than he demanded from himself: perfection, control, and an absolute absence of deviation. His mantra, the one he had recited before every mission since graduating from the academy, echoed in the quiet of his mind. No attachments, no deviations. The mission is the only truth. It was a creed that had kept him alive. It was a creed that had kept him sane in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of his duty. A flicker of ghost data danced across his secondary sensor screen, a faint, rhythmic energy signature that didn't match any known stellar phenomena. It was faint, almost subliminal, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. He ran a diagnostic, expecting a minor sensor malfunction, a common occurrence after a long patrol in the asteroid fields. The results came back negative. All systems were operating at optimal efficiency. The signal persisted, a soft, pulsing wave that seemed to resonate not with the ship's sensors, but with something deeper inside him. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in his chest, an echo of a feeling he had long since suppressed into non-existence. He dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the mind after 72 hours of continuous flight. He was disciplined. He was controlled. He was not susceptible to phantoms. His private comm chimed, a crisp, unobtrusive tone that cut through the cockpit's low hum. The icon of the director's office appeared on his main display. He accepted the call, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. "Director," he said, his voice a low, even baritone, betraying no emotion. "Captain," the director's voice replied, as smooth and cold as polished steel. There was no visual, only the sound, which was all she ever offered. Her voice was her instrument of control. "Your patrol is concluded. You have a new directive. Vector to the spire, coordinates attached. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged," Kalen said, his fingers already dancing across the navigation console, inputting the new course. The spire was the authority's central command and research facility, a place he hadn't been tasked to approach in years. It was the brain of the system, and he was one of its many sharp, sterile instruments. "Nature of the mission, Director?" There was a fractional pause, a beat of silence so brief most would have missed it. Kalen did not. It was a deviation, and he catalogued it. "Asset stabilization," the director said, her tone unchanged. "Designation E7 is experiencing an unscheduled biological event. Your presence is required as a contingency." Asset stabilization. The clinical phrase settled like ice in his gut. He knew what it meant. He had been a contingency before. Years ago, on a remote outpost, an Omega researcher had lost control, his pheromones driving the small Alpha security detail into a frenzy of territorial aggression. Kalen had been sent in to stabilize the situation. He remembered the chaos, the scent of blood and burnt ozone, the sound of men losing their humanity. He had moved through it all with cold precision, his own alpha nature locked down under layers of brutal training and chemical suppressants. His job had been to neutralize the source of the chaos. He had done so. The memory was a shard of glass in his mind, sharp-edged and colorless. He had followed his orders. He had completed the mission. But the silence that followed, the sight of the Omega, broken and empty-eyed, had stayed with him. It was a data point he could not erase. "The asset is an Omega," Kalen stated. Not a question, but a confirmation. The strange, pulsing signal he'd felt earlier intensified for a moment. A wave of what felt like pain. Need. He shook his head, clearing it. It was interference from the spire's powerful broadcast systems. Nothing more. The asset's designation is all that is required for you to know, Captain. The director's voice was sharp, a subtle reprimand. You will dock at Bay 4 and await further instruction. Your role is to be a calming agent, should the situation escalate beyond the capacity of our medical teams. Do you understand? Understood, Kalen replied, his voice a flat line. A calming agent. It was a euphemism, and they both knew it. An Alpha Prime, with his level of control and pheromonal dominance, was not a gentle hand. He was a failsafe. He was a weapon designed to overwhelm and subdue another's biology through the sheer force of his own. He was a cage made of instinct and authority. He banked the Nyx into a graceful, sweeping turn, the starfield shifting outside his viewport. The distant, needle-like form of the spire grew steadily larger, a monument to order and control. But the phantom signal pulsed stronger now, a desperate, rhythmic beat that felt less like a transmission and more like a heartbeat. It was a flaw in the perfect system, a ghost in the machine, and he was flying directly toward it. The mantra began to feel less like a shield and more like a lie. No attachments, but he could feel this signal, this distant cry hooking into him, a resonance he could not logically explain and could no longer entirely ignore. The mission was the only truth, he told himself, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt the cold, unsettling premonition that the truth was about to become far more complicated. The world had dissolved. The seamless white walls of Ilara's cell were sweating, the condensation tracing silvery, meaningless patterns that shimmered in the pulsating emergency lights, which had switched from a steady, clinical white to a rhythmic, urgent red. The air, once a sterile void, was now thick, heavy, and saturated with a scent so potent it was almost a taste on his tongue, the sweet, heady perfume of his own distress. The scent blockers had failed utterly, not with a quiet fizzle, but with a catastrophic breach, releasing a pheromonal wave that had washed through the level's ventilation system like a flash flood. He was the source of the alarms now wailing through the corridors, a high-pitched, panicked shriek that mirrored the one in his own mind. His body was a furnace, his skin exquisitely sensitive to the rough texture of his standard-issue tunic, the cool air brushing against his feverish cheeks. Every nerve ending was a live wire, humming with a painful, ecstatic energy. He was drowning in sensation, and yet his empathic sense, raw and untethered, stretched out, a net cast into the chaos of the spire. He could feel the fear of the technicians in the control room, their professional detachment shredded by a biological imperative they could not fight. He felt the rising aggression of the Alpha Guards on his floor, their discipline cracking under the strain of his broadcasted need. Their emotions were sharp, jagged things, scraping against his consciousness. He was a tuning fork, struck and left to vibrate, and their panic was making him vibrate faster, harder, threatening to shatter him from the inside out. The director's presence was a cold, sharp point of pressure in the chaos, a pillar of icy control observing the storm without being touched by it. She was watching, analyzing, recording the data from her failing asset. But through the cacophony, through the rising tide of his own fevered biology and the reflected terror of those around him, the other presence remained, the distant star. It was closer now, much closer. It was no longer a faint flicker, but a steady, burning light in the darkness of his delirium. It was a presence of immense calm, of unshakable control, but beneath that control was a deep, resonant power that called to the very core of him. It did not feel invasive or predatory like the alphas in the hallway. It felt solid, a rock in the turbulent sea of his senses. He clung to it, this phantom connection, focusing all his remaining will on its steady, rhythmic pulse. He didn't know what it was or who it was, but it was his only anchor. He sent out a silent, desperate plea, a stream of pure, unfiltered emotion. "Help. Please. I'm coming apart." The response was not in words, but in a feeling. A wave of focused calm washed over him, a cool hand on his fevered brow. It was a conscious, deliberate act, a mind reaching out to his, offering a moment of shelter. It was the most profound act of gentleness he had ever experienced. The gesture was so unexpected, so impossible in his world of clinical observation and detached control, that it broke through his panic. For a moment, the roaring in his ears subsided. The red lights seemed less frantic. He could breathe. Who was this? Who could project such discipline, such quiet strength into the heart of his chaos? Then the cell door hissed. Not the main transparent panel, but a small, sterile hatch he had never seen open before. A medical drone floated in, a silver orb with multiple articulated arms. It hummed softly as it approached him. "Asset E7, a synthesized voice announced, devoid of any inflection. "A chemical suppressant is being administered to restore biological stability." An arm extended, a hypospray needle gleaming at its tip. He recoiled, pressing himself into the corner of the cell. Suppressants. They wanted to shut him down again, to bury him back under layers of chemical numbness, to return him to the sterile silence. He had felt something real, a connection to the steady presence, and he would not let them take it away. "No," he whispered, the word a raw, ragged sound in his own ears. It was a word he had never dared to use. The drone continued its advance, its programming absolute. As the needle neared his arm, a fresh wave of panic, stronger than before, surged through him. He screamed, not with his voice, but with his mind, a psychic shriek of pure terror directed at the one anchor he had left. "Don't let them. Don't let them put out the light." The drone froze, inches from his skin. It trembled slightly, its internal gyroscopes whining in protest. The red lights in the cell flickered violently and then went dark, plunging him into blackness, save for the faint green glow of the drone's optical sensor. The alarms in the corridor stuttered and died. A profound silence fell over the spire, a silence that was not empty, but charged with a terrible, waiting energy. He had done that. His empathic projection, amplified by his fear and the fever of his heat, had overloaded the local grid. He was not just an asset, he was a weapon, and he had just, accidentally, fired it. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. In the darkness, alone with the paralyzed drone, Ilara trembled, the scent of his own fear now mingling with the sweet perfume of his need. The distant presence flared in his mind, no longer calm and steady, but sharp, urgent, and filled with a sudden, shocking intensity. It was no longer a star. It was a meteor, burning through the void, and it was coming for him. Kalen felt the Omega's psychic scream as a physical impact, a concussive force that slammed into his mind and made the cockpit of the Nyx feel suddenly small and suffocating. The ship had just completed its docking sequence with the spire, the magnetic clamps engaging with a solid, final thud. Through the viewport, the sterile, white-lit corridor of Docking Bay 4 was empty. but he could feel the panic from the levels below, a chaotic undercurrent of raw, primal instinct that bled through the station's shielded bulkheads. He had his own biology locked down, his senses filtered through a lifetime of discipline, but this was different. It was a direct, targeted cry, a harpoon of pure terror that had bypassed all his defenses and struck something deep inside him. Don't let them put out the light. His comm chimed again. The director. Captain, she said, and for the first time he detected a microscopic fissure in her icy composure, a hairline crack of strain. There has been a development. The asset has breached containment protocols. His empathic projection has just disabled the primary power grid for the lower containment levels. The situation is volatile. Kalen's hands clenched on the arms of his pilot's chair. He could see the status board for the spire on a secondary screen. A cascade of red warnings was spreading from the lower levels. A digital infection, system failures, network breaches, life support on emergency backup. The medical team? He asked, his voice tight. The suppressants have failed. The team is unable to approach. The asset's pheromonal output is at a critical level. There was another pause, longer this time. He could almost hear the calculations running in her cold, logical mind. Your role has been updated, Captain. You are no longer a contingency. You are the solution. Proceed to containment level 7. You are authorized to use any means necessary to subdue the asset and restore order. Any means necessary. The words were a death sentence. He was being ordered to do what he had done years ago, to be the Alpha Prime who could walk through the storm of an Omega's heat and impose his will, to smother the fire with overwhelming force, to break him, and all he could feel was that desperate plea echoing in his soul. Don't let them put out the light. It wasn't the cry of a chaotic force that needed to be subdued. It was the cry of someone terrified of the darkness. Director, Kalen said, his gaze shifting to the external sensor display. A new set of readings was scrolling across the screen, data from the spire's long-range weather arrays. There is a massive ion storm forming in the upper atmosphere. It's moving fast. It will be on us within the hour. It will ground all flights. The storm is a secondary concern, the director replied, her voice regaining its sharp edge of authority. Your mission is here, inside the spire. The storm is irrelevant. He heard the lie. He felt it. She was trying to box him in, to narrow his focus to the immediate threat, the one she wanted him to eliminate. But Kalen was a pilot. The sky was his domain. A storm was never irrelevant. It was a wall, a barrier, but it could also be an escape. He stood up, the seals on his flight suit hissing softly as he moved. He walked to the viewport, looking out at the sterile docking bay. He was a tool, an instrument of control, designed and honed to enforce the will of the authority. He was the cage they sent when the locks on the cell door were no longer strong enough. He was not supposed to feel the terror of the one inside the cage. He was not supposed to see them as a light that might be extinguished. No attachments, no deviations. The words were hollow now, the mantra of a man he was no longer sure he was. He could feel the Omega, E7, a frantic, terrified heartbeat in the dark underbelly of the spire. He could feel the approaching storm, a gathering of immense, impersonal power in the sky above. He was standing at a nexus point between two chaotic forces, one biological, one atmospheric, and the director, in her cold, calculated wisdom, was ordering him to walk into one while ignoring the other. It was a tactical error. Or perhaps it was a test of his obedience, a test of his function. He turned from the viewport, his decision crystallizing in the cold, quiet air of the cockpit. He was a pilot. A pilot's first duty was to understand the environment, to see all the variables, to choose the correct vector. The director saw only the asset. Kalen saw the storm, and he saw the light. The power came back on with a sudden jarring hum, and the cell was once again flooded with sterile white light. The medical drone rebooted, its green eye blinking, and it retracted the hypospray needle, its programming likely corrupted or reset by the surge. It floated silently back to its alcove, the small door hissing shut behind it. The reprieve was temporary. Ilara knew this. They would send something else. Someone else. His fever was peaking, the world a shimmering, distorted haze of sensory input. The scent of honeysuckle and jasmine was now tinged with the metallic tang of his own fear, a complex, agonizing perfume that was a map of his inner state. The connection to the Alpha, the pilot, was a burning thread in his mind. It was no longer a distant comfort. It was an immediate, palpable presence, just on the other side of the walls, a vortex of focused energy and disciplined power that made the air in his cell crackle. He could feel the Alpha's conflict, the rigid control go warring with a nascent, unfamiliar emotion. It was like watching a planet's tectonic plates shift, a slow, grinding, and inexorable movement toward a cataclysmic upheaval. He was the cause of that upheaval. A new voice echoed in his mind, not projected like the Alpha's presence, but a cold, clear transmission over the spire's internal comms routed directly into his cell. It was the director. E7, she said, her voice cutting through his delirium like a shard of ice. Your lack of compliance has created a significant operational failure. A final countermeasure is being prepared. If you do not willingly submit to stabilization, we will initiate a cryogenic stasis protocol. The risk of asset damage is now acceptable. Cryogenic stasis, to be frozen, to have his biological fire, this terrifying, magnificent storm inside him encased in ice, to be put into a darkness from which he might never wake. The threat was not delivered with anger or frustration, but with the cold, dispassionate finality of a scientist deciding to euthanize a failed experiment. The terror that washed over him was absolute. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He wrapped his arms around himself, his body racked with tremors that were no longer just from the fever, but from sheer, abject horror. His mind screamed into the psychic void, a single, desperate, wordless burst of pure feeling, aimed at the one presence that had shown him a flicker of empathy. He is here. He is here, and he is going to let them freeze me. In the cockpit of the Nyx, Kalen felt the Omega's terror as if it were his own. The director's voice, cold and precise, came over his private comm channel simultaneously. Captain, stand down. I repeat, stand down. The asset has become too volatile. We are moving to a cryogenic protocol. The risk of losing you and the Nyx in a direct intervention is no longer justifiable. Your mission is terminated. Acknowledge. Kalen stood frozen in the center of his cockpit, caught between two opposing commands. The director's order was logical. It was efficient. It preserved the more valuable assets, himself and his ship, at the expense of the malfunctioning one. It was the choice the system would always make. But the Omega's silent scream of protest, the raw, undiluted horror of being frozen alive, of being turned from a living, breathing being into a static object, drowned out all logic. He saw a flash in his mind, an image so clear it felt like a memory. A young man with wide, terrified eyes, curled in the corner of a white room, looking not at a monster, but at his only hope. Don't let them put out the light. No attachments, no deviations. The mission is the only truth. The words were ash in his mouth. What was the mission? To preserve order? To protect the authorities' assets? Or was it to follow the cold, inhuman calculus of a director who saw living beings as entries on a balance sheet? The psychic connection to the Omega was no longer a faint signal. It was a bond, a conduit through which he felt every nuance of the younger man's terror and despair. To follow the director's order would be to sever that bond, to stand by and allow that light to be extinguished. It would be an act of profound betrayal. It would be an act of cowardice. Sir, the voice of his co-pilot, a young, eager lieutenant named Jax, cut through his thoughts. Jax had remained on the bridge, monitoring ship systems. Did you hear that? Flight Command is ordering us to stand down. They're citing the storm and the internal security crisis. Kalen turned, his face an unreadable mask of calm. I heard them, Lieutenant. He walked back to the pilot's chair and sat down, his movements fluid and deliberate. His gloved fingers flew across the console, not shutting down systems, but awakening them. The low hum of the Nyx's engines deepened into a resonant growl. Sir, what are you doing? Jax asked, his voice laced with confusion and a growing sense of alarm. The docking clamps are still engaged. The director ordered. The director's command network has been compromised by the asset's empathic projection, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. It was a lie, but it was a plausible one. It was a deviation wrapped in the language of protocol. Her orders cannot be considered valid. We are proceeding with the original mission, asset stabilization, on my authority. But the storm. The storm is a calculated risk, Kalen cut him off, his eyes fixed on the navigation screen. He was overriding the docking clamps, inputting a manual release code that sent a jolt through the ship. Prepare for immediate departure. Captain, this is a direct violation. Kalen turned to look at his subordinate, his gaze cold and hard as obsidian. Are you questioning my command, Lieutenant? The unspoken power of an Alpha Prime, the sheer weight of his presence, filled the cockpit, silencing the younger man's protests. Jax swallowed hard and turned back to his console, his hands shaking slightly. No, sir. Preparing for departure. The docking clamps disengaged with a deafening clang. Outside the viewport, the spire began to recede. Kalen piloted the Nyx out of the docking bay and into the turbulent upper atmosphere. The first shockwave from the ion storm hit them, and the ship shuddered violently. Alarms began to blare. This was it. The first deviation, the first attachment. He had made a choice. He had chosen the terrified, silent voice in his head over the cold, clear voice of his commander. He was flying into the heart of a storm to reach a beacon he barely understood, driven by an instinct he had spent his entire life trying to kill. The mission was no longer the only truth. There was a new truth, now, fragile and terrifying, and he was chasing it through the lightning. The Nyx bucked like a living creature in torment. Outside the cockpit's viewport, the world was a maelstrom of violent, purple light and shrieking plasma discharges. The ion storm was a living entity, a vortex of pure chaotic energy that tore at the ship's shields and sent shudders through its very frame. Every alarm on the console was screaming, a symphony of electronic panic that would have broken a lesser pilot. But Kalen was not a lesser pilot. He was a machine fused with his vessel, his hands moving with preternatural calm over the controls. His mind, a cold, clear processor of 1,000 incoming data points. He was not fighting the storm. He was dancing with it. He angled the shields to deflect the worst of the energy blasts, rode the gravitational waves like a surfer, and threaded the ship through corridors of relative calm that opened and closed in the blink of an eye. His training, his discipline, his entire life had been a preparation for moments like this, for navigating the impossible. But this time, it was different. His focus was not merely on survival. It was split. One half of his mind was the pilot, the cold tactician battling the storm. The other half was attuned to the fragile, desperate thread of connection that led him to Ilara. The Omega's presence was a constant in his mind, a beacon of warmth and terror in the cold, violent chaos of the storm. It was his lighthouse, his true north. He could feel Ilara's awe and fear as the Omega sensed the ship's violent passage through the storm. The psychic link had become a two-way conduit. Ilara was no longer just a destination. He was a passenger in Kalen's mind, experiencing the flight as a terrifying, abstract collage of sensation. A roar, not of air, but of static and light, the feeling of being shaken apart, of metal screaming under impossible stress, the cold, focused calm of the pilot, a single point of stillness in the hurricane. It is for me. He is doing this for me. Kalen gritted his teeth as a plasma arc, thick as a starship's hull, slammed into their port side. The ship groaned, and the lights flickered. "Shields at 40%?" Jax yelled, his voice tight with fear. "We can't take another hit like that, sir." "We won't have to," Kalen said, his eyes never leaving the swirling chaos ahead. He was not flying blind. He was following the psychic thread, letting Ilara's presence guide him to a place the Spire's official flight paths would never lead. The director had assumed he would try to land at a primary docking bay. She would have reinforced those positions. But Kalen was aiming for something else, a forgotten part of the Spire's infrastructure he had found on an old schematic years ago. A secondary maintenance port nestled on the leeward side of the tower, long since decommissioned, but if his information was correct, still accessible. Another wave of turbulence hit, and a secondary console exploded in a shower of sparks. Jax cried out, batting at a small fire on his sleeve. The fire suppression system hissed, filling the cockpit with a cloying chemical fog. Through it all, Kalen flew on, his control absolute. He was pushing the Nyx to its limits, and beyond. He was pushing himself to his limits. The mantra was gone. In its place was a singular, burning purpose. Get to him. The shaking stops. A sudden, impossible stillness. The roar fades to a low hum. There is the taste of ozone, the feeling of immense power held in reserve. He is close. He is so close. Ilara felt the shift through the psychic bond. The violent, chaotic energy of the flight smoothed out into a focused, powerful descent. He could feel the pilot's concentration, the delicate maneuvers, the final approach. In his cell, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling. The fever still raged, but the abject terror had been replaced by a fragile, fluttering hope. A feeling so foreign, it was almost painful. He could feel the ship docking, the quiet, solid thud of its landing gear against the outer hull of the Spire. somewhere far from the main docking bays. He could feel the pilot disengaging from his vessel, his presence now a distinct, moving point of light within the structure of the spire itself. He was coming. He was walking through the cold, sterile corridors of this prison, and he was coming for him. The thought was so overwhelming, so impossible, that Elara almost collapsed. No one had ever come for him. He was a thing to be contained, to be used, to be observed. He was not someone to be rescued. Kalen moved through the silent, red-lit emergency corridors of the spire's maintenance level. The air was cold, tasting of dust and disuse. His flight helmet was still on, its internal sensors cutting through the gloom. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of his own respirator and the soft, magnetic hum of his boots on the metal deck plates. And another sound, a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but a feeling, a vibration in his bones, a heartbeat, Elara's. It was a frantic, terrified rhythm, a drumbeat pulling him forward. He found the stairwell from the schematics and descended, level by level, moving with the silent, efficient grace of a predator. But he was not hunting. He was answering a call. He reached the containment level. The Alpha guards he had expected to encounter were not there. The director must have pulled them back to form a perimeter around the main access points, never imagining he would take such a circuitous route. He stood before a heavy, reinforced door marked C7, Containment Cell 7. The air here was thick with a scent that bypassed his helmet's filters, a powerful, intoxicating aroma of honeysuckle, jasmine, and raw, desperate fear. It was the scent of the Omega. His Omega. The possessive thought was immediate, instinctual, and utterly shocking. He pushed it down. He was here to stabilize. He was here to help. The door was sealed with a magnetic lock, its control panel dark and unresponsive from the power surge. Kalen drew the plasma cutter from his belt. The tool, normally used for emergency hull repairs, ignited with a vicious hiss, casting a brilliant white light down the dark corridor. He burned through the lock mechanism, the smell of molten metal filling the air. With a final, groaning screech, the lock failed. The heavy door hissed open a few inches, releasing a wave of heat and pheromones so potent it made him stagger back a step. He braced himself, his discipline a shield against the biological call. He pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the dim, red glow of the emergency lights. And in the far corner, huddled against the wall, was the source of the beacon, the heart of the storm. A young man, slender and pale, wrapped in a standard-issue grey tunic that seemed too large for his frame. His hair was a dark, matted tangle, and his face was slick with feverish sweat. But his eyes were wide, luminous, and fixed on Kalen. They were the colour of a stormy sea, filled with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. The world, for Kalen, narrowed to that single point. The storm outside, the director's threats, the burning wreckage of his career and his life's creed, it all fell away. There was only the room, the scent, and the impossible, beautiful boy who was looking at him as if he were salvation. Elara watched the figure in the doorway, a silhouette of dark, armored plating against the brighter light of the corridor. The plasma cutter in his hand still smoked, a testament to the force of will that had brought him here. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, a physical manifestation of the power and control Elara had felt through their psychic connection. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. As the figure took a slow step into the cell, the world seemed to hold its breath. The roaring in Elara's blood quieted to a hum. The fever in his skin seemed to cool. The silence in the room was absolute, a sacred space carved out of the chaos. Then, with a soft hiss of releasing seals, the Alpha pilot reached up and removed his helmet. The face that was revealed was not what Ilara had expected. He had imagined someone hard, cruel, a face of sharp angles and cold authority. But the man before him was younger than he'd thought, his features carved with a severe, weary beauty. His dark hair was cut short, ruthlessly disciplined. A faint scar traced the line of his jaw, a single flaw in an otherwise perfect mask of control. But his eyes, a deep, startling grey like storm clouds, held a universe of conflict. They were the eyes of a man at war with himself, and in their depths Ilara saw not the cold gaze of a captor, but a reflection of his own desperate loneliness. Kalen let his helmet fall to his side, his gaze locked with Ilara's. The Omega was even more potent in person, his scent a physical presence in the air, a call that vibrated through every cell in Kalen's body. The instinct to cross the room, to claim, to possess, was a primal roar in his blood, a beast he had to wrestle into submission with every ounce of his discipline. He would not be the monster the director had sent him to be. He would not be the cage. He took another slow, deliberate step, then stopped, holding his ground, giving the terrified Omega space. "You came," Ilara whispered, his voice hoarse, cracked from disuse and fever. It was not a question. It was a statement of awe, of disbelief. Kalen's throat was tight. He managed a single, quiet affirmation. "I did." The simple exchange hung in the air, freighted with the weight of everything that had led them to this moment, the sterile confinement, the lonely vigil in the stars, the psychic call, the suicidal flight through the storm. It was all distilled into those two short sentences. "I called, and you answered." Ilara slowly, hesitantly, pushed himself away from the wall. He was trembling, not just from the heat, but from a hope so fierce it was almost indistinguishable from fear. This Alpha was not acting as he should. He was not dominating. He was not asserting his authority. He was waiting. He was offering a choice. Ilara took a shaky step toward him, then another. The scent of the Alpha reached him then, not the aggressive, territorial musk of the guards, but something clean, sharp, and profoundly calming. It smelled of the cold vacuum of space, of ozone after a storm, of a deep, unshakable stillness. It was the scent of sanctuary. It did not seek to overwhelm Ilara's scent, but to complement it, to soothe it. It was the answer to the question his body had been screaming. When he was only an arm's length away, he stopped. He was so close now, he could feel the heat radiating from Kalen's body through the flight suit. He lifted a trembling hand, his fingers hesitating in the space between them. Kalen remained perfectly still, a statue of controlled patience, giving him the agency, the final decision to close the distance. Ilara's fingers brushed against the cool, hard material of the flight suit over Kalen's chest. The contact was electric, a jolt of reality that grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of his fevered delirium. He let his palm rest flat against Kalen's chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of the pilot's heart beneath the armor. It was the same steady rhythm he had felt in his mind, the anchor that had guided him through the worst of his panic. It was real. He was real. A sob, sharp and painful, escaped him, and he swayed on his feet. Instantly, Kalen's hands were on his arms, steadying him. His touch was firm, sure, but exquisitely gentle. It was not the clinical touch of the medics or the rough handling of guards. It was a human touch, careful and protective. He guided Ilara forward until Ilara's forehead was resting against his chest plate, the cold material a shocking, welcome relief against his burning skin. Ilara inhaled deeply, drawing in the Alpha's calming scent, and for the first time since the heat had begun, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet in the storm of his own biology. Kalen's presence was a shield, his scent a balm. He was not a cage, he was a harbor. "What is your name?" Ilara asked, his voice muffled against the suit. An asset did not have a name. An asset had a designation. To ask for a name was to acknowledge a person. Kalen hesitated for a fraction of a second. A name was an attachment. "Kalen," he said, the name sounding strange in the charged silence. He had not been Kalen in a very long time. He had been Captain. He had been Alpha Prime. "What is yours?" "Ilara," he replied, the name a soft breath. He had never spoken it to another soul. It was the one thing they had not been able to take from him. Kalen. Ilara. The names settled between them, forging a new reality. They were not an Alpha and an Omega, a pilot and an asset. They were two people meeting in a prison cell at the heart of a storm, their lives irrevocably and impossibly intertwined. As Kalen held Ilara, feeling the tremors in the slender body begin to subside, a sharp, metallic chirp echoed from the comm unit on his wrist. He ignored it. He knew who it was. The director, the system, the world outside this small, quiet sanctuary. But for a moment longer, he allowed himself this. He allowed himself the warmth of another being in his arms, the scent of a connection he had never believed possible, the quiet, revolutionary feeling of having made a choice that was entirely his own. The calm, however, was a fragile, fleeting thing. The reckoning was coming. The director's voice, when it came, was not through the comm on Kalen's wrist, but broadcast from a speaker in the ceiling of the cell, a disembodied, omnipresent sound that shattered the fragile peace. It was as cold and sharp as ever, but now it was laced with the fury of a system whose perfect control had been defied. Pilot Kalen, you have made a grave and unforgivable error. You have compromised a critical asset and directly violated a Class 1 directive. You are a traitor to the authority. Kalen didn't flinch. He kept one hand steady on Ilara's back, a silent reassurance, while his other hand moved to the side of his helmet, which he had clipped to his belt. He activated its external microphone. "The asset was destabilizing," Kalen said, his voice a low, steady counterpoint to the director's clipped tones. "I acted to preserve him." It was the language of the system, a final, futile attempt to frame his rebellion as an act of duty. A dry, mirthless sound that might have been a laugh crackled over the speaker. "You acted on a biological imperative you were trained to suppress. You have been compromised. The asset has contaminated you." The director's words were precise, designed to strip him of his agency, to reduce his choice to a mere instinctual failure. "Security teams are en route to your position. They will retrieve the asset. You will be decommissioned." Decommissioned. It was a sterile word for a brutal process. To be stripped of his rank, his ship, his identity. To have his mind wiped and his body repurposed for manual labor in the outer colonies. It was a living death. Ilara stiffened in his arms, his fear returning, a sharp spike Kalen could feel through their bond. He was not just afraid for himself, but for Kalen. He had brought this doom upon his rescuer. "He is not an asset," Elara said, his voice surprisingly clear and strong as he pushed himself away from Kalen's chest to face the unseen speaker. "My name is Elara." It was a declaration of existence, a protest hurled into the cold, indifferent machinery of the spire. "Your designation is E7, the director's voice replied, flat and dismissive. "Your personal identifiers are irrelevant data points. You will be placed in cryogenic stasis and reprogrammed. Your anomaly will be corrected." Kalen looked down at Elara. The fever still shone in the Omega's eyes, but it was now mixed with a fierce, defiant fire. He was no longer the terrified, huddled creature Kalen had found. In the face of their shared condemnation, he had found his strength. And in that moment, Kalen knew, with absolute certainty, that he had made the right choice. He would not trade this defiant, living soul for the cold, empty approval of the system he had served his entire life. He had flown through a storm of lightning and plasma to reach this boy. He would not abandon him to a storm of guards and technicians. "Director," Kalen said, his voice ringing with a finality that surprised even himself. "You are mistaken. E7 is no longer your asset, and I am no longer your pilot." He reached down and with a single decisive motion unclipped the comm unit from his wrist and crushed it under the heel of his boot. The director's voice cut off mid-sentence, leaving behind a profound and liberating silence. The spell was broken. They were no longer having a conversation with the system. They were fugitives from it. The low, rhythmic thud of approaching footsteps began to vibrate through the floor. The security teams. They had minutes, perhaps less. "We have to go," Kalen said, his voice urgent. He looked at Elara, his gaze intense. He would not drag him. He would not force him. This had to be his choice, too. "They will do what she said. They will freeze you, try to erase what you are. Or you can come with me. I don't know where we will go. The outer rim, the uncharted territories. It will be dangerous. We will be hunted." He was offering nothing but uncertainty, a life on the run, a future stripped of all security. He was offering a terrifying, unknown freedom. Elara looked around the white cell, the only home he had ever known. It was his cradle and his cage. He had been safe here, in a way. He had been fed, clothed, protected from a world he had never seen. But he had not been alive. He had been an instrument, waiting to be used. Now he looked at Kalen, at the man who had defied his entire world for a stranger he had only felt through the void. He saw the risk, the danger, but he also saw the promise of something real. A life where his name mattered. A life where he was not an asset. A life where he would not be alone. The choice was not a choice at all. It was the only answer he could possibly give. "Where would we go?" he asked, his voice soft, not with doubt, but with the dawning wonder of a future he had never dared to imagine. "Anywhere but here," Kalen replied, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. He held out his hand. Elara took it. His hand was small and warm in Kalen's armored glove. The contact was a seal, a pact made in the heart of the prison. Their rebellion was no longer a quiet, internal one. It was now a physical act of escape. Together, they turned and ran from the cell, leaving the wreckage of their old lives behind them, the sound of the approaching security team, a fading drumbeat marking the end of one world and the violent, uncertain birth of another. They moved like ghosts through the labyrinthine maintenance corridors of the spire, Kalen leading the way, his stride long and purposeful, his hand never releasing Ilara's. Ilara's legs were weak from the fever and long disuse, but Kalen's strength seemed to flow into him, a steadying current. The sounds of pursuit grew more organized behind them, shouted commands, the clang of armored boots, the high-pitched whine of pulse rifles charging. The director was not letting her assets go without a fight. Kalen guided them up a narrow service ladder, into a dark ventilation shaft that smelled of ozone and lubricant. It was a tight squeeze, the darkness absolute, but Ilara felt no fear. Kalen's presence was a solid, warm reality beside him, a shield against the dark. "The Nyx is our only chance," Kalen murmured, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space. "She's damaged, but her core systems are intact. If we can get to her before they seal the maintenance ports, we can get out." They emerged back into a corridor near the decommissioned port where the Nyx waited, a dark, angular shadow against the swirling, angry sky of the receding storm. Red emergency lights flashed across the ship's hull. A squad of security guards was already there, setting up a perimeter, their rifles raised. They were trapped. Kalen pulled Ilara back behind the cover of a junction box, his mind racing, calculating angles and odds. There were too many. A direct assault was suicide. Ilara closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. He could feel the guards' minds, a mixture of cold duty, nervous energy, and a low-level aggression amplified by his lingering pheromonal signature. They were focused, disciplined, but their thoughts were a network, a web of shared communication and purpose, a web he could touch. He remembered the power surge that had knocked out the lights in his cell, the way his fear had become a weapon. Perhaps it could be again. He focused, not on fear this time, but on something else. He reached out with his mind, not with a scream, but with a whisper. He found the threads of their concentration and gently, subtly, pulled them. He projected an image, a feeling, into their minds, a sound down the corridor behind them, a fleeting shadow at the edge of their vision, a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease. The guards shifted, their focus momentarily breaking. One of them spoke into his comm, reporting a sensor ghost. Another turned to look down the empty hallway. It was a tiny distraction, a flicker of uncertainty, but it was all Kalen needed. "Now," he whispered. He moved with blinding speed, a blur of black armor. He didn't use a weapon. He was the weapon. He took down the first guard with a precise, disabling blow to the neck, the second with a sweep of his leg that sent the man crashing into a third. It was a brutal, efficient ballet of violence that lasted less than 5 seconds. Before the remaining guards could even register what had happened, Kalen was on them, and they fell. He stood over the last unconscious guard, his chest heaving, then turned back to Ilara, his expression unreadable. "Let's go." He lowered the ramp of the Nyx, and they scrambled inside, the heavy metal door hissing shut behind them, sealing them in. The cockpit was a mess of sparking consoles and the acrid smell of burnt wiring, but the main displays flickered to life as Kalen strapped himself into the pilot's chair. Ilara collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion. "Hold on," Kalen said, his hands flying over the controls, bypassing damaged systems, rerouting power from non-essential functions to the engines and shields. The Nyx shuddered, its engines whining in protest before roaring to life. Outside, pulse rifle fire began to stitch glowing patterns across the viewport as more security forces arrived. Kalen ignored them. He wrenched the ship upward, a gut-wrenching vertical ascent that pushed Ilara deep into his seat. They broke free of the spire, the needle-like tower shrinking below them, a monument to a life that was already a memory. They ascended into the bruised, purple twilight of the storm's aftermath. The planet below was a swirl of grey clouds and polluted oceans, a world Ilara had only ever seen on a viewscreen. Now, he was seeing it with his own eyes, and he was leaving it behind. Kalen's hands never stopped moving, his focus absolute as he plotted a jump vector, a blind leap into the uncharted spaces between the stars. The nav computer chirped its confirmation. A course was laid. Ilara reached out and placed a hand on Kalen's forearm. The pilot flinched almost imperceptibly at the contact, his muscles tense beneath the flight suit, but he did not pull away. The contact was electric, real, a quiet anchor in the chaos of their escape. Kalen turned to look at him, and for the first time, the mask of the Alpha Prime pilot was gone. The cold, calculating warrior was gone. In his eyes, Ilara saw the weary, uncertain, and profoundly brave man underneath. He saw Kalen, and in that gaze, there was no regret. There was only a quiet, defiant hope. He was not an asset. He was Ilara. He was not a pilot. He was Kalen. With a final, decisive movement, Kalen engaged the hyperdrive. The stars outside the viewport elongated into streaks of brilliant white light, then collapsed into a swirling tunnel of impossible blues and purples. The Nyx, battered but free, shot forward into the unknown, leaving the authority, the spire, and the entire system of their past behind. They were two fugitives in a damaged ship, with no destination and no allies, hunted and alone. But they were together. Their journey was just beginning, and for the first time in either of their lives, they were truly free.